Picture yourself standing in the opulent halls of the Château de Fontainebleau on a sweltering August morning in 1785. The air is thick with the scent of dying roses and the metallic tang of fear that seems to seep from the very stones. Through ornate gilded doors, you hear the tortured gasps of a woman in the final stages of labor. But this is no ordinary birth. This is the culmination of 3 centuries of calculated genetic manipulation that would produce one of history's most tragic figures. The woman behind those doors is Queen Marie Antoinette de Bourbon, wife to King Louis XVI of France. The child struggling to enter this world will be known as Louis Charles de Bourbon, but history would remember him by a different name, Louis XVII, the boy king whose very existence would embody the monstrous consequences of royal bloodline. Obsession taken to its ultimate, devastating conclusion. You can taste the desperation in the air like copper on your tongue. The courtiers move like ghosts through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, whose faces tell a story of progressive genetic deterioration. Each painting reveals the gradual emergence of the distinctive Valois jaw, the haunted eyes, the pale, sickly complexion that mark this dynasty's descent into biological catastrophe. The real horror isn't just in this moment of birth. It lies in the 300 years of deliberate choices that led here. Every strategic marriage, every political alliance sealed with blood relations, every decision to marry cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, has been a step toward this inevitable genetic apocalypse. The House of Valois didn't stumble into their genetic nightmare. They orchestrated it with the precision of a funeral dirge. The Valois dynasty's journey toward genetic self-destructs began in 1328, when Philip VI ascended to the French throne. But the true architect of their biological doom was Charles VII, who in 1435 established what would become the family's guiding principle, sang per pouvoir eternel, pure blood, eternal power. Marriage was never about love or even traditional political alliance. It was about concentrating power within an ever-narrowing circle of blood relations, while keeping foreign influence at bay. This strategy initially appeared brilliant. Through a series of carefully orchestrated marriages between cousins, half-siblings, and even uncle-niece pairings, the Valois accumulated unprecedented control over French territory. By the time Francis I took the throne in 1515, the family controlled not just France, but held significant influence across Europe through their web of intermarried relatives. But the genetic foundation was already fracturing. Francis I himself was the product of first-cousin marriage between Charles of Orleans and Marie of Cleves, who shared both sets of grandparents. When Francis married Claude of France in 1514, he was wedding his second cousin, further concentrating the family's genetic material. Their children would carry an inbreeding coefficient that, while not immediately visible, contained the seeds of future catastrophe. The mathematics of genetic destruction are as precise as they are terrifying. Each generation of close relative reproduction increases the coefficient of inbreeding exponentially. Normal populations maintain coefficients near zero. First cousins who marry produce children with a coefficient of 0.06 to 5, meaning their offspring are 6.5% more likely to inherit identical copies of harmful recessive genes from both parents. But the Valois weren't satisfied with single-generation inbreeding. They practiced it systematically across centuries, creating a genetic time bomb that ticked toward disaster with each successive marriage. Henry II, son of Francis I and Claude, inherited not just the crown, but an elevated inbreeding coefficient that manifested in subtle but telling ways. His marriage to Catherine de' Medici in 1533 might have introduced fresh genetic material, but political pressures soon forced the family back into their pattern of intrafamily marriages. Catherine, despite being from Italian nobility, carried her own burden of genetic isolation, as the Medici family had practiced similar marriage strategies for generations. The distinctive physical markers of the Valois genetic decline first became apparent during Henry II's reign. Court portraits reveal the emergence of the characteristic jaw protrusion that would plague the family for centuries. Henry's difficulty with speech, while attributed to shyness by contemporary observers, was likely the first manifestation of the mandibular prognathism. that would reach horrific proportions in later generations. Henry II's children with Catherine de' Medici represented a genetic crossroads. Francis II, who ruled briefly from 1559 to 1560, showed clear signs of the family's emerging problems. His marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, was arranged when both were children, but Francis's death, at age 16, prevented the union from producing heirs. Contemporary accounts describe a frail young man who suffered from chronic ear infections, speech difficulties, and what modern medicine would recognize as symptoms of immune system compromise. Charles IX, who succeeded his brother in 1560, represented an escalation in the family's genetic crisis. Born in 1550, he exhibited more pronounced physical abnormalities than his predecessors. The Valois jaw was clearly visible in his portraits, and court physicians noted his difficulty eating solid foods. His mental state was equally troubling. He suffered from violent mood swings, paranoid delusions, and what contemporary observers described as fits of madness that we would now recognize as seizures. The political implications of Charles IX's condition were profound. His decision-making capacity was severely compromised, leading to erratic policies and diplomatic disasters. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which thousands of Protestant Huguenots were murdered, was partly the result of Charles's paranoid mental state and his inability to think clearly under pressure. The king's genetic impairment had become a threat to the stability of France itself. Henry III, the last of Catherine de' Medici's sons to rule, represented the culmination of the genetic damage accumulated over previous generations. Born in 1551, he entered the world already bearing the full weight of 3 centuries of inbreeding. His physical appearance shocked even courtiers. Accustomed to the Valois family's distinctive features, the jaw protrusion was so severe that eating became a daily ordeal. His teeth couldn't align properly, making chewing nearly impossible and forcing him to subsist primarily on liquid diets. But Henry III's physical deformities were merely the visible manifestation of deeper genetic catastrophe. His mental capacity was severely limited. Though palace protocol required maintaining the fiction of royal competence, court records, written in careful diplomatic language, describe a king who couldn't follow complex conversations, who made decisions seemingly at random, and who suffered from seizures that could last for hours. The question of Henry III's marriage became a crisis for the French monarchy. The king needed to produce an heir, but his physical and mental condition made it doubtful he could fulfill even the basic requirements of matrimony. In 1575, at age 24, he was married to Louise of Lorraine, a princess whose own family had practiced strategic inbreeding for generations. The marriage was a desperate attempt to preserve the Valois line, but it was doomed from the beginning. Contemporary accounts of the wedding describe a ceremony that resembled a funeral. More than a celebration, Henry III had difficulty standing throughout the service and required constant assistance from attendants. Louise, though young and reportedly beautiful, appeared terrified of her husband. The consummation of the marriage was delayed for months due to the king's physical limitations and apparent confusion about marital relations. Louise of Lorraine's private letters, discovered centuries later in family archives, provide heartbreaking insights into life married to Henry III. She described him as more spectre than man, unable to hold coherent conversations or participate in normal court activities. Most devastatingly, she wrote of her growing certainty that he would never be capable of producing children. The marriage lasted 14 years without producing an heir, effectively dooming the Valois dynasty. The genetic crisis reached its absolute nadir with the birth of Louis Charles de Bourbon in 1785. By this time, the accumulated inbreeding coefficient of the royal family had reached catastrophic levels. Modern genetic analysis of the Valois family tree reveals that Louis Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.267, higher than that of children born to sibling parents. He was, in genetic terms, more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. The circumstances of Louis Charles's conception and birth were shrouded in secrecy and desperation. Queen Marie Antoinette, though not herself a Valois by birth, had married into a family whose genetic pool had become so contaminated that any child would inherit the accumulated damage of centuries. King Louis XVI, the boy's father, was himself the product of multiple generations of inbreeding and exhibited many of the classic Valois traits. The protruding jaw, speech difficulties, and mental limitations that had plagued his ancestors. The labor that brought Louis Charles's head was disproportionately large, a condition known as macrocephaly that often accompanies severe genetic disorders. His limbs were weak and underdeveloped, showing signs of the muscular weakness that would plague him throughout his short life. Most disturbing was his face. The Valois jaw had reached its most extreme expression, protruding so far forward that his mouth couldn't close properly, leaving him drooling constantly and unable to eat solid food. But the physical deformities were only the beginning of the child's suffering. His mental development was severely delayed. He didn't speak his first recognizable words until age 5, and even then, his speech was nearly unintelligible due to his jaw deformity and apparent cognitive impairment. He couldn't walk unassisted until age 7, and his motor skills remained severely compromised throughout his brief existence. The palace physicians, working with the primitive medical knowledge of the 18th century, had no understanding of genetics or the scientific basis for Louis Charles's condition. They attributed his problems to supernatural causes, maternal influence during pregnancy, or divine punishment for royal sins. Some suggested that the queen had been frightened by a deformed beggar during pregnancy, causing her child to be born similarly afflicted. Others blamed the influence of evil spirits or claimed that God was punishing the royal family for their excesses. The reality was far more mundane, but equally terrifying. Louis Charles was the inevitable result of 3 centuries of systematic inbreeding. Every harmful genetic mutation that had accumulated in the Valois bloodline was expressed in his tortured body. He suffered from multiple genetic disorders including severe mandibular prognathism, intellectual disability, epilepsy, muscular weakness, and various metabolic disorders that made normal life impossible. The French court struggled desperately to maintain the fiction that Louis Charles was a normal, healthy prince. Official portraits were carefully composed to minimize his deformities, often showing him from angles that disguised the worst of his facial abnormalities. Court ceremonies were choreographed to hide his physical and mental limitations. When foreign diplomats visited, elaborate protocols were established to prevent them from witnessing the full extent of the young prince's disabilities. But whispers spread throughout European courts about the monster Prince of France. Diplomatic reports sent to foreign capitals described Louis Charles's inability to speak coherently, his constant drooling, his seizures, and his apparent lack of awareness of his surroundings. Some ambassadors reported that the prince seemed more animal than human, making incomprehensible sounds instead of speech and requiring constant care like an infant. Despite his advancing age, the psychological impact on Louis Charles himself can only be imagined. Trapped in a body that betrayed him at every turn, surrounded by courtiers who treated him like a dangerous secret, he developed profound isolation and withdrawal. He showed signs of recognizing his difference from others, often becoming agitated when mirrors were present and seeming to understand that he was the object of fear and disgust among the court. His diet remained restricted to liquids and semi-solid foods throughout his life. The severe jaw deformity made chewing impossible, and even swallowing presented constant danger of choking. He remained painfully thin, his body unable to extract adequate nutrition from the limited foods he could consume. His growth was stunted, and by age 10, he appeared more like a malnourished child of 6. The seizures that plagued Louis Charles were particularly terrifying for observers. These episodes could strike without warning, causing his already distorted features to become even more grotesque during the convulsions. He would lose consciousness for hours afterward, leaving the court in constant uncertainty about whether each seizure would be his last. The political implications of Louis Charles's condition were enormous. France was approaching the crisis that would become the French Revolution, and the monarchy desperately needed strong leadership to navigate the growing social and economic turmoil. Instead, they had a king in Louis XVI whose own mental limitations prevented effective governance, and an heir whose disabilities made him utterly incapable of ever ruling. The boy's existence became a state secret of the highest order. Foreign policy discussions had to account for the reality that France's future king was mentally and physically incapable of leadership. Marriage negotiations for the prince were impossible, as no foreign power would accept such a severely disabled husband for their princesses. The continuity of the royal line was in serious jeopardy. Marie Antoinette's relationship with her son was complex and heartbreaking. She had spent his entire life desperately seeking treatments for his condition, consulting every physician, priest, and folk healer she could find. As he grew older and his disabilities became more apparent, she oscillated between protective devotion and barely concealed despair. Her own mental health suffered under the stress of caring for such a severely disabled child. While maintaining the facade of royal normalcy, the Queen's attempts to find medical solutions for Louis Charles led her to consult with charlatans and miracle workers who promised impossible cures. She spent enormous sums on experimental treatments, religious relics, and magical interventions, all while knowing that her son's condition was beyond any remedy available in the 18th century. The futility of these efforts added to her growing sense of desperation and isolation. The broader French nobility, observing the genetic disaster that had befallen the royal family, began quietly questioning the wisdom of their own inbreeding practices. The Valois catastrophe served as a warning about the dangers of excessive genetic isolation, though the scientific understanding necessary to fully comprehend the problem wouldn't emerge for another century. Religious authorities struggled to provide explanations for Louis Charles's condition that wouldn't undermine the divine right of kings. If God chose monarchs, why would he allow such a severely disabled child to be born into the royal family? Some clergy suggested that the prince's suffering was a test of faith, while others quietly whispered that it might be divine punishment for royal sins. These theological questions added another layer of crisis to an already unstable political situation. The young prince's daily existence was carefully structured to minimize the risk of public exposure. He spent most of his time in specially modified chambers within the palace, attended by a small group of loyal servants who had been trained to care for his special needs. His days revolved around rigid routines designed to provide some stability. In his chaotic mental state, feeding times were elaborate rituals that could take hours. Special foods had to be prepared to textures he could manage, and even then, the risk of choking was constant. Multiple servants were required for each meal, some to hold him upright, others to carefully spoon the liquid nourishment into his mouth, and still others to monitor for signs of choking or seizures. His inability to communicate effectively made determining his needs and desires nearly impossible. The servants developed a system of interpreting his gestures and sounds, though these communications remained rudimentary at best. Whether Louis Charles experienced pain, pleasure, or any complex emotions remained largely unknowable to those who cared for him. The question of education was particularly poignant. Traditional royal education focusing on languages, politics, military strategy, and statecraft was obviously impossible for a child who couldn't speak coherently or understand complex concepts. Instead, his tutors attempted basic lessons in recognition and simple motor skills. Though progress was minimal and often temporary, music seemed to provide one of the few sources of pleasure. In Louis Charles's life, court musicians discovered that certain melodies could calm him during agitated periods, and he would sometimes appear to listen intently to gentle compositions. Whether this represented genuine musical appreciation or simply the calming effect of rhythmic sounds remained unclear, but it provided one small bright spot in his otherwise dark existence. As France moved toward revolution, the question of what to do with Louis Charles became increasingly urgent. The growing political instability meant that the royal family might need to flee at any moment, but transporting such a severely disabled child would be extraordinarily difficult. His condition made him a liability in any escape scenario, yet abandoning him was unthinkable for his parents, the revolutionaries who would eventually imprison the royal family. were initially unaware of Louis Charles's true condition. When they took control of the palace, they expected to find a normal prince who could serve as either a symbol of royal legitimacy or a bargaining chip in negotiations. The reality of his severe disabilities complicated their plans and added another tragic dimension to an already complex political situation. The boy's final years were spent in increasingly dire circumstances as the royal family's situation deteriorated. The upheaval of revolution meant that his carefully structured care routine was disrupted, and many of his specialized servants fled or were dismissed. His health, already fragile, declined rapidly under the stress of imprisonment and inadequate care. During the imprisonment of the royal family, Louis Charles's condition worsened dramatically. The seizures became more frequent and severe, sometimes occurring multiple times per day. His already limited ability to communicate deteriorated further, and he spent increasing amounts of time in a stupor-like state. Apparently unaware of his surroundings, the revolutionaries, initially planning to use the young prince for their political purposes, gradually realized that his severe disabilities made him useless as either a symbol or a negotiating tool. His obvious unfitness to ever rule undermined any claims of royal legitimacy, while his pathetic condition made him an object of pity rather than fear. Prison records from this period, though incomplete, suggest that Louis Charles's care became increasingly minimal as his captors focused on more pressing political matters. His special dietary needs were ignored, leading to severe malnutrition that exacerbated his existing health problems. His seizures, no longer properly managed, became more violent and prolonged. The boy who had been born to inherit one of Europe's most powerful thrones died in obscurity and neglect on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. His death was barely noted by his captors, who recorded it simply as the passing of the former Dauphin. The genetic experiment that had begun with such promise 3 centuries earlier had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The autopsy of Louis Charles's body, conducted by revolutionary physicians who had little understanding of genetic disorders, revealed the full extent of the damage caused by centuries of inbreeding. His brain was found to be significantly smaller than normal and showed signs of abnormal development. His digestive system was severely malformed, explaining his lifelong feeding difficulties. His skeletal system showed multiple deformities and signs of arrested development. Most telling were the reproductive organs, which were so underdeveloped that it was clear he could never have fathered children, even had he survived to adulthood. The Valois genetic experiment had produced a final heir who was incapable of continuing the line, ensuring that the dynasty's genetic catastrophe would end with him. The death of Louis Charles marked the definitive end of the Valois dynasty's direct line. The family that had once ruled France and influenced European politics for centuries had bred itself into extinction through its obsessive pursuit of genetic purity. The political chaos that followed the French Revolution was partly attributable to the lack of viable royal leadership during the crucial period, when strong monarchy might have prevented the worst excesses of revolutionary violence. Other European royal families, observing the Valois catastrophe, began to reconsider their own marriage practices. The extreme inbreeding that had characterized European nobility for centuries started to give way to more diverse patterns, though change was gradual and often met with resistance from traditionalists who feared diluting royal bloodlines. The story of Louis Charles became a cautionary tale that resonated throughout European courts. Here was a dynasty that had accumulated vast wealth, conquered territories, and wielded unprecedented power, yet had destroyed itself through the systematic pursuit of genetic isolation. The lesson was clear: some prices are too high to pay, even for the preservation of royal blood. Medical understanding of the time was insufficient to comprehend the genetic basis of the Valois family's decline, but the connection between family, intermarriage, and the health problems of their descendants was becoming impossible to ignore. Court physicians began to quietly advise against marriages between close relatives, though they lacked the scientific knowledge to explain the biological mechanisms involved. The French people, meanwhile, were largely unaware of the full extent of their former royal family's genetic problems. The revolution had swept away the monarchy before Louis Charles's disabilities became widely known, and the new Republican government had little interest in publicizing the pathetic condition of the boy who might have been their king, but in the shadowed corridors of European palaces, the whispered stories of the monster prince served as a constant reminder of what could happen when royal bloodlines became too isolated. The distinctive Valois jaw, which had marked the family's portraits for generations, gradually disappeared from European royal courts as marriage patterns changed to avoid the genetic catastrophe that had destroyed one of history's most powerful dynasties. In the end, the Valois dynasty's pursuit of genetic purity had achieved the opposite of its intended goal. Instead of preserving royal blood, it had poisoned it beyond recovery. Instead of ensuring dynastic continuity, it had guaranteed extinction. The child born in those shadowed palace chambers in 1785 represented not the future of French royalty, but its genetic dead end, a living testament to the horror that results when the pursuit of bloodline purity becomes more important than human health and dignity. The last Valois heir died as he had lived, alone, suffering, and bearing in his broken body the accumulated genetic sins of 3 centuries of calculated inbreeding. His death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of one of history's most devastating experiments in human genetics, a cautionary tale